George Harris rose before dawn each morning, though the rest of the world seemed asleep. His small bungalow on Maple Street sat silent under the blanket of night. Inside, the ticking of a lone mantel clock echoed through empty rooms. George, once a lieutenant in the infantry, now carried a different kind of burden, the weight of solitude. He dressed slowly, pulled on a faded wool sweater, brushed the thin silver hair from his forehead, slipped into worn loafers. His mind drifted back to distant deserts, the roar of helicopters, the faces of comrades lost to time. In those days, every sunrise held purpose. Now, his days passed in quiet routines. A brief walk to the corner store, a sandwich and milk at midday, afternoons spent in a sagging armchair by the window, watching snowflakes drift. His neighbors waved politely when he passed, but few paused to chat. His only company was the memory of service, the ache of absence, and the gentle crackle of a crackling fire on chilly nights. George tapped his cane on the floor, sighed, and prepared to face another solitary day. On a bright winter morning, George bundled himself against the cold, thick overcoat, scarf, wool cap. Snow glittered on rooftops, and breath formed clouds in the frosty air. He locked his door, pocketed a crumpled list, and hobbled down Maple Street toward the corner store. Each step was measured, heart hammering faintly. But he pressed on. There was milk to buy, newspapers to peruse, the comfort of routine guiding him. The wind whispered through bare branches, carrying the scent of wood smoke. George paused, hand on his chest, a pinch of doubt in his eyes. His heart had throbbed strangely all morning. He shook his head, determined to ignore it. "Just the cold," he muttered, and continued. At the store, the friendly clerk greeted him by name. George nodded, selected a carton of milk and a loaf of bread, paid quietly, and tucked the groceries under his coat. Outside, the sky had clouded over, soft flakes beginning to drift downward. He started home, head down against the wind, mind drifting between caution and stubbornness. Halfway home, George felt a sharp twinge in his chest. He stopped, hand pressed to his heart, breath coming in shallow gasps. The world tilted. He reached for his cane, but darkness pressed at his vision. He staggered forward into a drift of snow, knees buckling. The world slowed as he crumpled to the ground, the snow cold and yielding beneath him. His grocery-laden arms slackened, and the carton of milk cracked open, seeping white into the glistening snow. George lay still. His mind drifted between frost-laden memories, a boyhood Christmas, the day he enlisted, the home front letters he never sent. Each memory blurred, replaced by the cold's creeping embrace. His breath slowed, vision dimmed, and the world fell silent. A faint whimper cut through the hush. At first, George could not tell dream from reality. The whimper grew closer, urgent, pleading. A figure loomed at his side, a stray German shepherd, ribs showing through a matted coat, a wounded hind leg dragging in the snow. The dog's eyes, wise haunted, met George's. He raised a weak hand and the dog whined, nosing George's shoulder. The dog pawed at the snow, trying to burrow through the crust to reach George's face. It licked his cheek, breath ragged as though begging him to wake. A crack of ice under a distant footstep made the dog spring back, ears flat with fear, but its gaze never left George's pale face. The dog nudged George's fingers with its cold, wet nose, then turned and glanced urgently toward the street, then back at George, as if pleading for help. Summoning strength, the dog dashed away across the snow-covered lawns, leaving paw prints behind. 3 blocks away, Samantha Taylor walked her small terrier, Penny, along the sidewalk cleared by yesterday's plow. She noticed fresh paw prints, cutting across the drifts, and hurried after them, curiosity pulling her from the cleared path into the quiet hush of backyards. Suddenly, the dog Max, Samantha would later learn, burst from between 2 hedges and barked urgently. Samantha froze as Max darted to the curb, then to the street corner, then back at her, tail stiff. He barked again, a sharp, insistent call. Following his gaze, Samantha's pulse quickened. There, half buried in a snowdrift, lay an elderly man, snow crusting his hair. Samantha dropped the leash, sprinted, called 911 on her cell. Max curled protectively beside the man, nudging him awake with licks to the cheek, barking softly. Samantha reached them, knelt, found George's pulse faint but present. "Stay with me," she murmured, draping her scarf around his shoulders. Max licked George's hand, eyes fierce with loyalty. In minutes, paramedics arrived, sledding a stretcher over the snow to George. Samantha guided them to his side. Max whined as his friend was lifted, but stayed by the side of the stretcher, nose pressed against George's face. The paramedic lifted Max gently. "This one's a hero," she said. They loaded George into the ambulance. Samantha scooped Max into her arms. The dog rested his head on her shoulder, breathing easy now that George was safe. Sirens wailed as they sped toward St. Barnabas Hospital, blue lights dancing on the snow-piled streets. At the hospital, doctors warmed George's core, treated early hypothermia, and examined his heart. Samantha stayed at his bedside while Max lay dozing on a blanket nearby. The doctor spoke quietly with Samantha. "He's stable. He grayed out from cold, low blood sugar and a mild arrhythmia. We'll keep him overnight." George drifted, in that liminal space between sleep and consciousness, haunted by the dreamlike memory of a dog's warm nose. He awoke to the soft whine of Max, his eyes opened to find the German shepherd's face inches from his own. George's heart swelled. "Max," he croaked. The dog wagged his tail, ribs rising and falling. Samantha and Nurse Rivera entered with a bowl of warm broth for George and a dish of water for Max. George sipped carefully, then gazed at the dog. "You saved me," he whispered. Max licked his hand, tail beating softly. Then George remembered. Months ago, during a harsh winter, he had placed scraps of meat and bread on his porch railing for a stray he named Max, never expecting return. Yet here was Max repaying kindness with loyalty. George's eyes welled. The next day, George insisted on visiting Max, who was moved to the city animal shelter for treatment. Samantha accompanied him in her warm car, Max panting happily in the passenger seat. At the shelter, the staff greeted Max as hero, bandaging his wounded leg and feeding him hearty meals. When George stepped into the kennel area, Max heard his voice and whined. He strained at the leash, pressing into George's leg. George knelt, tears streaming. "I'm here, old friend." Max licked George's face, jumping into his arms as George scooped him up. Samantha watched as George and Max swayed together, two souls, healed by hope. George turned to the shelter manager. "I want to adopt him," he said softly, and with a few signatures, Max Hero became George's devoted companion. Back at Maple Street, George opened his front door to a new reality. Max padded in, sniffing. Corners, tails sweeping the snow from the threshold. George placed a warm blanket by the fireplace, set out dishes of water and food, and sat in his favorite armchair. Max settled at his feet. George's heart felt lighter. That night he spoke aloud to Max in the silent room. "You gave me a reason to get up again." Max pressed closer, resting his head on George's slippered foot. The mantel clock ticked. But now their home echoed with companionship. Winter melted into spring. Side by side, George and Max explored new paths gardened at dawn, watched robins build nests and greeted neighbors together. Max's presence coaxed George out of isolation. People stopped to pet the dog and chat. George found himself smiling, more hope blossoming in his chest. One sunny morning, George and Max walked along the sidewalk when suddenly George clutched his chest, dizziness flooding him. Max barked sharply, then raced to a nearby fence where Mrs. Delgado was hanging laundry. The dog pawed at her skirt until she noticed George slumped against a lamppost. Mrs. Delgado called 911. Max darted back to George, snuggled under his arm, whimpering. George's eyes met Max's. "You saved me again," he whispered, as paramedics arrived. Months later, in the dead of night, a fire broke out in the Taylor family's home on Willow Lane. Samantha, now a close friend of George's, raced through her front yard when she heard barking. Max bounded down Maple Street, barking and racing in front of the blaze. He dashed to the open bedroom window, pawing and barking to alert the Taylors inside. The family awakened just in time, escaping through the front door as flames engulfed their home. Firefighters arrived to find Max barking at the door, refusing to leave. He had saved a second family. The next day, newspapers dubbed him Maple Street's Guardian. That spring, the mayor declared a day to honor Max and the courage he had shown. A ceremony in the town square drew neighbors, children, local veterans, and families. George stood at the podium, Max at his side, both wearing simple medals. George's voice trembled with gratitude. "This dog came into my life when I thought it was too late for either of us," he began. "Max reminded me that kindness is repaid tenfold, that loyalty can heal the deepest wounds. Because of him, I found purpose again, and our community is stronger for it." Tears shimmered on many faces. Max sat obediently, head high, accepting pats and applause. The townspeople cheered, celebrating not just a dog, but the power of second chances. Years passed. George's hair grew whiter, his steps slower. But Max, ever vigilant, remained at his side. Autumn's crisp air and golden leaves became their favorite season. Each afternoon they wandered through the park, George's hand resting on Max's head, both at ease. Neighbors waved as they passed. Children would rush to pet Max, calling him hero, but George merely smiled. He knew Max's truest service was to him. One day, as leaves drifted down in swirls of red and gold, George paused on a bench. Max lay beside him, head on George's knee. George patted Max's fur gently. "This was the best fall of my life," he said softly. Max closed his eyes in contentment. In late autumn, during one of their park visits, George's steps faltered. His vision blurred. He reached out to steady himself on Max's broad back. The world tilted. Max barked, not aggressively, but urgently, an alarm to draw help. A passing jogger, Mrs. Chen, saw Max's repeated barks and rushed over. She supported George's shoulders, called 911. Max pressed against George, whimpering softly as paramedics arrived. This time, George clung to consciousness, comforted by Max's steadfast presence. At the hospital, doctors stabilized him. When George awoke, Max lay on a blanket at his bedside, tail thumping. George smiled weakly. "You did it again," he whispered. Winters. First snow fell gently as George returned home with Max's paw prints beside his own. Their bungalow glowed with warm lights. Inside, George settled into his armchair. Max curled at his feet. That evening by the hearth, George stroked Max's silvering muzzle. "You've given me more than I could ever repay," he said. Max's eyes shone with unconditional love. Days passed. George's health waned. Max never left his side. Then, one crisp autumn morning in the following year, George Harris slipped away peacefully during their walk in the park. Max lay beside him, head on George's chest, as though protecting him to the end. The news of George's passing spread quickly through the town he loved. On Maple Street, neighbors laid flowers and notes at the foot of George's porch. At the park, children whispered tales of Max, the dog who had saved not one, but many lives. At a winter ceremony, the town unveiled a bronze statue. George seated, on a bench, cane in hand, Max faithfully curled at his feet. Beneath, a simple plaque read, "In memory of George Harris and Max, his loyal friend forever united by courage, compassion, and love." Tears and applause mingled in the cold air. Max, now elderly and frail, wore a small wreath of holly at his neck. He sat quietly by the statue, head bowed, as residents paid tribute to the man who had found hope through a stray dog, and to the dog who had given hope back. George and Max's story reminds us that no one is truly beyond rescue, and that kindness can ripple through every life it touches. In the darkest hours, a friend, human or animal, can light the way home. May we all have the courage to reach out and the heart to welcome those in need. For sometimes, a life saved is a life renewed, and a bond formed in compassion lasts forever.